Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. This is the July 2026 bonus episode. It's Nancy, of course. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. And as we settle in, allow me to share a bit about tonight's episode. For this episode, we are going to travel back in time. Back to 1931, the height of the Great Depression. Money was tight for just about everyone. This was even true for the strappiest of bootstrappers, people who were born and raised to survive. People like Laura Ingalls Wilder, who'd endured a childhood growing up on the American frontier in the late 1800s, only to find herself in her 60s and virtually broke. That's right. Half pint barely had a penny to her name. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Just a few years earlier, Laura and her husband Almanzo, they lived modestly but comfortably on their farm in rural Missouri. That is, until their daughter Rose suggested they withdraw their life savings and invest in the stock market, which they did, pooling together a lifetime of scrimping and saving for their final years. It was terrible timing. It was 1929, and within months, the stock market crashed, and like millions of Americans, Laura, Almanzo, they lost everything. Everything except their memories. And now, she was mining those memories for their last opportunity at some viable income. It was, she knew, a long shot. But Laura Ingalls Wilder hoped that someone, a publisher, would be interested in her life story. A book about what it was like to grow up in a little house on the prairie. By her 40s, Laura was already a published writer, and she wrote for magazines, including a column about farming. But she dreamed of publishing a book. The title of the book she conceived of was Pioneer Girl. But she couldn't seem to get any traction on her manuscript. Once again, it seemed like a case of bad timing. It was the Depression, and publishers didn't think people wanted to read about how hard life was. They wanted to escape. So Laura thought of ways to make her stories seem happier, more upbeat, harsh realities softened into inspiring, teachable moments. That in the end, no matter how hard life gets, everything will work out just fine, thanks to the love of your family. But her daughter Rose, she had another idea. Laura's daughter Rose was herself a prominent writer and editor, and she was her mother's closest collaborator. Rose was something of a true crime buff before there was a term for such a thing. And she was clear what the story of the Pioneer Girl was missing was murder. Seriously, what this book needed was a long saga about an elusive band of serial killers who terrorized the Midwest in the late 1800s. And what was most chilling is that much like the Ingalls, they too were a family. At least that's what they said. They called themselves the Bender family. Ma, Pa, and 2 grown children, all of whom were believed to be behind the murders of at least 8 people. Tell that story, Rose told her mother, and you'll sell this manuscript. Laura wasn't sure. She imagined her book would be more aimed towards young people. But maybe, Laura thought, her daughter was right. So Laura, with the help of her daughter, folded in a juicy story of her father crossing paths with at least one member of the Bloody Bender family and narrowly escaping alive. Now, as you likely know, the first book by Laura Ingalls Wilder, called The Little House in the Big Woods, it did not include anything about serial killers. Nor did the subsequent 8 books or the TV series from the 1970s it was based on. Nor are there any lurking killers in the Netflix series that was just released this summer. So Laura ended up not including any details about the Bloody Benders in her books. And that was probably for the best. But many others have written about the family from the 1870s up until the early 20th century. Their sensational crimes were covered by just about every newspaper across the country. And one of the reasons why people found the Bender family so fascinating was because they were never caught. So who the Benders really were and where they ended up, it remains a mystery to this day. And for well over a century, there have been plenty of wild theories and half-truths. But a recent book, published in 2022, titled Hell's Half Acre, The Untold Story of the Benders, a Serial Killer Family on the American Frontier, by a writer named Susan Janusis. It offers one of the most intricate and likely most accurate version of these very strange events. And I will link to that book along with some other key sources, including material from the Library of Congress and a revealing memoir, a first-person account of what the investigation was like, written by the wife of one of the victims. Now, it is unlikely that Laura Ingalls or any members of her family ever met the Benders. And Laura, she was born in 1867. And when this all started, she was just 3 years old. But Laura and her family could claim a connection to the Bender family. A connection that started all the way back in the 1870s. The Ingalls, they only lived in Kansas for a year. And at the time, their swift departure from that area, it was seen as a failure. Little did they know, they were the lucky ones. Just a half a mile away were their neighbors, fellow homesteaders who would find themselves the hapless victims of 4 scheming killers, better known as the Bloody Benders. It was late December 1872, a bitterly cold winter morning, as a young father named George Longcore bitterly regretted what he'd done. He'd waited too long to leave. The week before, the weather was glorious, the sun warm, the air crisp. His horses could have clopped along with ease. Then, with a surge of icy wind, everything changed. But George, he'd come to expect it. In the 3 years he lived on the prairie, he learned that's just how things went. Life could change in a moment. The proof was tucked right next to him. On his wagon, in a cozy bundle, was his precious baby girl, Marianne. Mary Ann wore the little hat and tiny mittens her mother had knit for her just before she was born. They were supposed to be the first of many mittens, scarves, and sweaters to keep her little girl warm. Only now, these items were more like keepsakes, tokens of remembrance of a mother the little girl would never know. Just 7 days after giving birth to a happy, healthy baby girl, George's wife, Mary Jane, suddenly died from postnatal complications. This was one of the most common tragedies on the prairie. These homesteads were so isolated, so far away from any doctor, there was no way to get help for a mother or a baby in time. After his wife died, George did his best to take care of this baby by himself. He was a blacksmith, which actually gave him an opportunity to make an income that a lot of other homesteaders didn't have, including the Ingalls. But God, he was tired. And he was sad. And he was lonely. And he could only hope these feelings weren't contagious. He didn't want to infect his joyous and jubilant baby girl with his febrile melancholy. Then one day, as he sat in the cabin with Mary Ann clutched to his chest, he heard somewhere in the distance the most unfamiliar of sounds, the sound of laughter, of playing, of children. And he followed the sound to the nearby home of his new neighbor, a highly respected doctor named William York. Dr. York and his wife were around the same age, maybe a little older, in their early 30s, and they had 3 children. The Yorks welcomed George and doted on the little girl, and Mrs. York agreed to help out with the child while George tended to his blacksmith business. And initially, it proved an ideal arrangement. Then in the fall of 1872, George received an important letter. The letter was from his late wife's parents, who lived in Iowa. And perhaps, given the circumstances, would George consider leaving Kansas, moving to Iowa, and letting them help raise little Mary Ann? By then, the girl was nearly 2 years old, and she was at that age where she needed constant oversight, which he couldn't do. Nor could Mrs. York, who was by then expecting her 4th child sometime in the spring. And George didn't want Mary Ann to add to the kind woman's burden. George felt torn about leaving the homestead. Like many men making their way west during that time, he fought in the Civil War. Then this move out to Kansas, under the Homestead Act of 1862, was his chance at a fresh start. He could honestly say he fared better than most on that prairie. Many didn't make it a year before leaving, be it in a covered wagon or a pine box. But this was what was best for little Mary Ann. Anything could go wrong out there, especially for a child. The Yorks, they were sad to see them leave, but they supported his decision. George and William York had become close friends, and the doctor agreed to sell George his own wagon and a team of horses at a steep discount. So his only regret that freezing cold December morning was that he'd waited a week too long. This was going to be a cold and uncomfortable ride. But off they went, father and child, forging ahead, starting over once again. never realizing that day marks the beginning of the end. With a decent team, a horse-drawn wagon back then moved at a steady pace of roughly 3, maybe 5 miles per hour. And with the load George carried on that wagon, the ride from Independence, Kansas, to his in-laws' place in Iowa, it would take at least 3 weeks, which meant George was expected to arrive in Iowa sometime in late January or early February. So when January, even February came and went, without a word from George, Dr. York and his wife didn't think much of it. And it might have stayed that way. The fate of George Longcore and his daughter Marianne, a minor musing. Then in early March, Dr. William York heard some strange and unsettling news. He heard through the grapevine that earlier in the winter, someone had found a wagon and some horses along a trail just outside of a town called Cherryvale. The men who recovered the horses and wagon had placed a notice in the local newspapers, hoping to track down the owner, but they never heard from anyone. And now it was March, and the men wanted to keep the horses and the wagon, but they wanted to ask around one last time, just in case somebody knew something. When William York heard the description of the team and the wagon, they sounded just like the ones he'd sold George. But he would need to see the team and the wagon to be sure. He was already planning a trip to visit his father about 100 miles away in Fort Scott, Kansas. He told his wife he felt compelled to find out for certain, and he was going to make an extra stop or two to see, were these the horses and the wagon that he'd sold George? And if so, well, then he'd have to find out what happened to George and little Marianne. He told his wife the whole trip there and back would take 10 to 14 days. He expected to be home on March 18th. When he failed to return on March 18th, now it was his wife, whose name was Mary, it was her turn to worry. It wasn't like her husband to not turn up without a word. He too served in the Civil War, working as an assistant surgeon on the battlefield. There he encountered the kind of injuries no medical school could ever prepare him for. And that was Will tending to the injuries of other men. Near the end of the war, Will was himself captured by a rival faction and tortured. And part of their torture was being forced to march hundreds of miles from Missouri to Louisiana, wearing only torn rags with no food, water, or shelter. Once at the POW camp, he was strung up and forced to hang by his thumbs. He'd managed to survive, but the jagged scars from the rope on his thumbs, they were still there. A reminder of how fragile life was and how cruel men could be. Mary York was herself a nurse during the war, and the two shared a bond over their desire to help others. William, however, he threw himself into helping people, sometimes to the detriment of his own well-being. She prayed he hadn't helped someone, then gotten sick himself. Mary went to the local post office each day expecting a letter. Some kind of news. By March 21st, when he hadn't returned, she knew something was wrong. By the end of the month, she was frantic, and she reached out to William's family to see if they could help. There she learned her husband had made his destination. He had visited his father in Independence, Kansas. Then after that, he headed back home. Only on the way back, he took a few extra days to check in on that team of horses, that wagon, to confirm if it was indeed the rig he'd sold to his friend. And he told Mary and his father that if he could confirm that wagon belonged to George, he would need to find out any information he could on the whereabouts of his friend George and his little girl Marianne. And now he too was missing. William's father was in poor health, so he couldn't ride up and down the prairie searching for his son. So he asked William's brothers, 31-year-old Alexander and 21-year-old Ed, to help. Alexander, the politician, hired a private investigator. And as soon as they could, they now hit the trail in search of William York, hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. William York's family was prominent enough that news of his disappearance soon made headlines. But so far, that coverage hadn't made the search for William any easier. But these stories did connect some crucial dots. It turned out William, and perhaps George, were just the latest missing persons in what appeared to be a series of mysterious disappearances along that road. And it seemed these men were all travelers, men visiting from somewhere else, never to be seen or heard from again. The locals had their suspicions about someone who might be involved. But when pressed, they didn't offer many specifics. They had to be careful. She might be listening. And if she heard something bad that they said, sorry, but they were as good as dead. The Bender family moved to rural Kansas in 1870. German immigrants, or were they Norwegian? Nobody knew for sure. Because the Bender family, they kept to themselves. There were 4 of them. There was Pa, an angry old buzzard in his 60s who rarely spoke to anyone, only muttered to himself in what was believed to be German. Then there was Ma, a sour-faced woman believed to be in her 50s, but with a stout, unyielding presence, reminiscent of an ancient petrified tree stump. Their alleged son, he was John, a blond man in his late 20s, who acted more like a child. He spoke near-perfect English, but punctuated the end of every sentence with a giggle that sounded somehow silly, yet sinister. Then there was Kate. Kate Bender was the daughter, their youngest. But you would be hard-pressed to find any resemblance. And it wasn't just her looks, it was also her upbringing. She seemed different from the rest. Kate, she also spoke perfect English, claimed to be of Franco-German origin, said she studied in Paris, spoke fluent French, and planned to go back there one day, very soon. Though the Prairie was about as far from Paris as the moon. When the Bender family first arrived, it appeared they had plans to open a modest bed and breakfast with a small market that sold the essentials. But soon enough, the promise of a decent bed and breakfast deteriorated into more of a flophouse. The place was a run-down shack, the same skeletal structure that belonged to the previous tenants who had tried and failed to make it on the prairie. And if it were a bed and breakfast, there was no actual bed. Their guests, if they were lucky, slept on a pile of hay and a pallet, with a dirty old sheet as a room divider. And there was no real breakfast either. Maybe some muddy coffee, a stubby nub of bacon, and it was always the same stingy offerings, even though the Benders had a whole pen of healthy hogs and an orchard bursting with fruit trees. Even from the outside, the vibes were bad at that place, if you could even find it, because the Benders were too cheap to keep the oil lamp lit for visitors at night. So making Kate the Bender family's front of house wasn't a bad idea. Young and pretty with long hair and bright eyes, Kate drew them in. If she lived here, well, it wasn't all that bad. For the young male travelers who spent months alone on the trail, Kate's youthful radiance obscured the grit and grime on every surface of that dump. And she enhanced the journeyman's big dream of making his fortune out west. The reality of that dream, it would set in somehow, somewhere in time. If they were lucky, guests at the Bender cabin woke up the next morning with all of their belongings and more than a few fleas. But for the unlucky ones, the Bender family's chosen few, they didn't wake up the next morning with their belongings because they never woke up at all. Their heads never hit a pillow. Instead, these unsuspecting victims of the bloody Bender family were repeatedly struck in the back of the skull with at least one of 3 hammers the family kept handy for this very purpose. Usually the one wielding the hammer was John, maybe Pa. And sometimes, just to make triply sure their target was dead, one of the Benders would slide a knife across their victim's throat. The Benders weren't meticulous murderers. They were as slovenly with their slayings as they were with their hospitality. And their only feat of German engineering was this one hidden, human-sized trap door. The trap door, discreetly placed along a large plank wood floor just off of the main room, opened to a makeshift cellar. A hole in the ground, really. The trap door, a way to quickly dispose of their victims, at least temporarily, until later, when the world was asleep and it was dark and silent on the prairie, where the only sound would be the rhythmic chug of John with a shovel, the hasty digging of another shallow grave, his high-pitched cackle piercing the night, signaling to the rest of the family the deed was done. Despite their sloppiness, it took a long time, far too long, for people to figure out what the Benders were up to. Though there were certainly early signs, the Benders were an unusual family. Ma and Pa, they were horribly, pathologically rude. John was a creep. But it was Kate who was the most deceptive. She was like a little angel, obsessed with death. So much so, she sought to make a career out of her interest in the unliving. Not as a murderer, but as a medium. Kate claimed to be a spiritualist, a person who believes that not only does an individual soul live on in the afterlife, there exists a plane where the living and the dead can communicate. And they do this through human conduits, capable of channeling a loved one from the other side. Back then, group seances were a popular form of entertainment. And in the best of circumstances, a way for grieving individuals to find a sense of solace, especially in the years after the Civil War, when women in particular sought out mediums as a way to reconnect with their lost husband, son, brother, a way for them to express their sorrow, ask questions, and get assurances that things were going to be okay. And in the best of circumstances, they walked away with their curiosity satisfied, feeling at peace. But Kate Bender, she took her talents a step further. She said she could communicate with the dead and heal the living. She referred to herself in promotional materials as a doctor, not an MD in the strictest sense, but a spiritual surgeon who didn't need a scalpel. She once claimed to heal a man's injured foot with a wave of her hand. Though after his treatment, when the man complained his foot still hurt, Kate explained that was his failure, not hers. He had to believe, or it didn't work. But even those who did believe in Kate's capabilities, those who sought her spiritual services, those who believed she had a connection to the afterlife, they didn't know that every time they met with her, they put themselves in mortal danger. Very few lived to tell the tale. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. No matter how many times Kate Bender hissed at her to close her eyes, Julia Hessler tried, but she simply couldn't do it. Because if she closed her eyes, she was terrified she wouldn't know who or what would be there when she opened them again. Julia Hessler was a local woman who worked at a hotel in the town of Cherryvale. Julia was a unique woman, starting with her height. She was very tall, nearly 6 feet, and her stature afforded her a sense of independence. Smaller, less physically imposing women didn't tend to enjoy. Julia was proud that she wasn't afraid to venture out on her own, even as the sun went down, and she made her way to the Bender family home for the first time. She wasn't afraid, because there was nothing to be afraid of. Katie Bender was a friend. Julia and Kate worked together at the hotel. Kate had recently joined the staff as a waitress. And in this podunk town like Cherryvale, newcomer Kate was charismatic and interesting. When Kate revealed she had a gift as a medium and invited Julia over for a seance, she enthusiastically agreed. Julia had joined a few of Kate's seances at the hotel with her coworkers, but this, Kate promised, would be the real deal. The sun slowly sank behind Julia as she made her way to the cabin. with just enough light for her to notice the condition of this place. A word, cabin, she used generously. In reality, it was a rundown, decrepit shack. You wouldn't want a dog to live there, never mind a family. And here, Kate worked in a hotel, claiming her family had some kind of inn. Maybe Julia should have turned around. But soon Kate was at the door, inviting her inside. And the interior of this place was as awful as the outside, made worse by a rank odor that caught in Julia's throat. She couldn't help but gag. It was a reflex, an instinct she couldn't control. Kate was saying something to her, but Julia couldn't hear her. Her voice was drowned out by the low, steady drone of flies. There were flies everywhere, darting around Julia's head, landing on her shoulder. Flies so big and greasy, you could see the bristly hairs on their backs. You could feel the furious rumble of their wings. Julia was surprised to see she was the only one there. Where was everybody else? Didn't you need a group of people for a seance? But Kate assured her, no, it was much better this way. The spirits, the energy, could be focused entirely on Julia. And that's what made Kate's magic its most potent. Kate lit a single candle, withered and bent like an arthritic pinky. A tiny pinprick of light flickered, as if the candle itself was fearful of the darkness descending upon them. Kate gestured for Julia to please take a seat on the opposite side of the table. Now she was facing Kate, with her back to a dingy sheet that divided this tiny room. Julia wasn't sure if they were alone, but the place was so small. If there was someone behind that curtain, they had to be so close she would hear them breathe. Kate clasped both of Julia's hands, instructing her to close her eyes. Again and again, until finally Julia forced her eyes to snap shut. Then she tried to listen. Above the din of the flies, as Kate murmured in a low voice, and called out for the dead. What spirits were with them tonight? Who was going to step forward? Who was going to cross over from the darkness to the light and make themselves known? Julia could barely pay attention. She could still feel the flies landing on the side of her ear, the sound of them tapping against the sheet. And with her eyes squeezed shut, she fantasized of how she would get out of there, how she would run, find a barn, and steal a horse. Then she felt something else. Not a fly, but the presence of something, of someone else. She wrenched her eyes open. Kate was at the table, her eyes closed, still whispering for a spirit. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind Kate, Julia could make out a figure, a shadow that stood just outside of the halo of the candlelight. And then next to that figure, another shadow. And then another. And as her eyes adjusted, she saw there were now 3 people, real, actual people, standing behind Kate. These had to be the 3 members of the Bender family: Ma, Pa, and John. But Julia hadn't heard them come in. Had they somehow silently made their way? from somewhere in the dark and stood behind Kate. Julia's eyes scanned their faces, but no one moved, no one smiled, no one said a word. Julia called out for Kate, but she didn't answer. Julia stood up and said she had to go. By then, the room was completely dark, and she had to feel her way towards the door, her fingers catching on the grime and grease. She finally stumbled out the front door. Tripping over her long skirts, she tumbled to the ground outside and landed on her wrist. She pushed herself upright and walked uneasily into the open prairie, away from the front of that house. She only made it a few yards before she heard the crack of a gunshot. Then another. Then voices, yelling, arguing in German and in English. Were they shooting at her? Were they really shooting at her? Julia fell to the ground, this time on purpose, taking a moment of refuge in the tall grasses. Her wrist throbbed, and her long skirts were now heavy with dirt. She managed to steal a look back, and that's when she saw the glowing of the lamplight. She made out the silhouette of Kate's brother John. He was obviously toting a shotgun and ready to fire it once again. And in the glow of that lamplight, she saw Kate's face, her expression, and she was smiling. Julia understood then. It was her fear that made Kate happy. She didn't know or care a thing about the spirits in the afterlife. How could she? Kate Bender didn't even have a soul. The incident with Julia, it took place back in 1871, well before anyone knew anything about missing men. Maybe this was an early sign of what they were capable of. But what was she to have done back then? At the time, there was maybe one sheriff for the whole county. That area was already so lawless and violent. Having someone aim a shotgun at your back to get you off their property, in some parts of the county, that's how people said goodbye. Still, anyone who heard Julia's story would have to agree. The Bender family, they were bad people. It was best just to stay away. But in the spring of 1873, those investigating the disappearance of William York, they had no choice. They needed to stay close to the Bender family. The local sheriff and the detective hired by William's family, they'd spent the last 2 months since he disappeared in March, tracking down every lead, interviewing families of possible victims, retracing William's steps, and all roads led them back to the Bender cabin. Authorities didn't know exactly what had happened, but they assumed, sadly, William was dead. And they knew the Benders had something to do with it. On May 6, 1873, the local sheriff, along with one of William's brothers and trusted local men, went to the Bender's place to talk. As they approached the Bender property, the men braced themselves. They had to be ready for anything, and they thought they were. But they were wrong. When the sheriff went up to the front door, it was already open, and when he peered inside, there was nobody there. At some point, the Bloody Benders, all 4 of them, they blew town. And they took everything with them, though they did leave something behind. An overpowering stench. As the men entered the cabin, the smell of the place nearly knocked them over. A smell that everyone in the room already knew. Anyone who had been on a battlefield knew that odor. The smell of death. But this cabin was small, and there were no signs of human remains. So where was this stench coming from? As they looked around the house, someone noticed an uneven plank of wood. Realizing it was a trap door, he opened it. And what was underneath that door? It wasn't a cellar. It was a hellhole. It was a pit saturated with the blood and viscera of their victims. It was a horrific discovery, made worse by the knowledge this pit wasn't it. There was more. They needed to find the actual bodies. So William York's younger brother rushed out of the cabin and towards the orchard. And he noticed a spot where the ground was uneven. He knew his brother was there. And he was right. William York was the first body found on the property. The remains of George Longcore and, tragically, little Marianne, they were also found there, buried in a shallow grave together. There are 6 more corpses found on site, along with 6 more murders attributed to the Bender family, a total of 14 in all. The majority of the victims were men, solo travelers just looking for a place to sleep, only to have their final moments a living nightmare. Now, the Benders were the travelers, somewhere out there on the road. It appeared the family split up. Ma and Pa, they bought train tickets to Missouri. John and Kate headed south to Texas. Kansas authorities offered a sizable reward for any information leading to their capture. And yet, the reward remained untouched. No one knew where they were. People were most interested in knowing what happened to Kate. And there were some fascinating reports that she was living in Texas as a man. Then there were the rumors that she and John had been killed by a band of outlaws. And that was just back in the 1870s. Some 20 years later, there were 2 women, a mother and daughter, who were accused of being Ma and Kate Bender. And despite virtually no evidence, these 2 women nearly went to prison just to close the case. Now it's been, 150 years? Maybe someday someone will know what really happened. But for now, we'll just have to end the story the way Laura Ingalls Wilder might. A world where no matter how bad things seem, it all works out in the end. Even in a little house, a lonely house, a murder house on the prairie. Thank you so much for listening to the July bonus episode. And this is just a small piece of a much bigger story that I highly recommend reading Hell's Half Acre, which I will link to in the show notes, along with other key sources from the episode. I'll be back in August with an all-new episode. Thanks again for your support. I really appreciate it. Until next time, nighty-night.